since according to the progressives, government was no longer a danger to the liberties of the citizens, then you could increase the scope of government. That's the essential argument. All of the progressive politicians argued for this. I think there may be no greater example than Theodore Roosevelt. And in particular, point to a speech that Theodore Roosevelt gave in 1910. This is his New Nationalism speech. It's a speech which then became the foundation for his attempt to regain the presidency later in 1912. And in that speech, Roosevelt called for the state to take a much more active role in affecting economic equality. And here he doesn't mean only economic equality of rights or opportunity, but he says equality of material circumstance, a kind of material equality that really had not been a part of the equation in the American tradition before then. This would require superintending the use of private property, perhaps redistributing private property. And Roosevelt in his New Nationalism speech is very, very upfront about that. Private property rights had been serving as a brake on some of the more aggressive progressive policy proposals. That had to change. We had to, in the words of Roosevelt, come to kind of have a social view of property and a social view of our property relations. This was justified by new circumstances. It necessitated a new conception of government, and natural rights could no longer be understood as a kind of brake against this power of the government. Woodrow Wilson had outlined a similar view of the power of the government and a similar view of the relationship between the government and the individual in a concise but very revealing essay from the 1880s called Socialism and Democracy. And that's an essay that we have provided in the Constitution Reader. And I want you to take a look at that because you can see how Wilson admits in that essay that socialist conceptions of the power of government, that society is more important than the individual, that the whole is more important than the individual, that is very consistent with the progressive understanding of democracy. And so the first thing he does in the essay, and let's turn to it, this is an essay that begins, or the part of it that's relevant to us begins on page 646 in your reader. He says, let's talk about what socialism is. How does socialism view the relationship between the individual and the state? He says, socialism proposes that all idea of a limitation of public authority by individual rights be put out of view, and that the state consider itself bound to stop only at what is unwise or futile in its universal superintendence alike of individual and of public interest. The thesis of the state socialist is that no line can be drawn between private and public affairs which the state may not cross at will. All right? So the power of the state trumps the rights of the individual. And Wilson says, now, that's pretty close to how we progressives view democracy. He says, in fundamental theory, socialism and democracy are almost, if not quite, one and the same. Well, why are they one and the same? They're one and the same, Wilson says, because our theory of democracy, we progressives, we think that democracy is not limited by individual rights. Remember, that was the great conundrum for the founders. How do they balance democracy and the protection of rights? You don't want to have so much consent that the majority can consent to something that abuses the liberty of the minority. That's a different conception of democracy than the one that the progressives have. Wilson says about democracy and socialism, quote, that they both rest at bottom upon the absolute right of the community to determine its own destiny and that of its members. Men as communities are supreme over men as individuals. Limits of wisdom and convenience to the public control there may be. Limits of principle there are, upon strict analysis, none. Right. So the only limit on government from the point of view of the progressives, according to their view of democracy, is sure, there might be things that government can't do very well, that wouldn't work out very well, that are impractical, but those aren't principled limits. They're not principled limits, say, in the way that the founders would understand natural rights to be a principled limit on the authority of government.